are happy to convene this hearing. It's a joint hearing of the Committee on Energy and the Committee on Economic Development, the latter being the committee that I chair, Robin Schimminger. We are going to waive our opening statements this morning in order to expedite the hearing. And with Chairperson Paulin's consent, I just wanted to acknowledge that as we sit here at this moment in time down on 16th Street near the Avenue of Americas in St. Francis Xavier Church, Father Daniel Berrigan, Thomas was his brother, Father Daniel Berrigan, who was well known to those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, is being laid to rest at age 94. He made the front page of today's New York Times above the fold. I doubt any of us ever will. So with an acknowledgement to Dan Berrigan, let us begin. And we know that he rests in peace this morning. Our first testifier, Amy, do you want to, she will be joined by someone?
Yeah.
Yes. Audrey Zibelman, the chair of the Public Service Commission.
Is joined by Mike Worden, Director of Electric Division, DPS.
Thank you, and thank you for remembering Father Berrigan. That was nice.
You're too young to remember him.
I am not too young. I wish I were, but I'm not. Good morning, Chair Paula and Chair Schimminger, and my name is Audrey Zibelman, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Public Service. Michael Worden, our Deputy Director for Electric and our Utility Rates and Service Division, is here with me today and will be available to answer all those questions that I cannot. As you know, the Public Service Commission is charged by law with the responsibility for setting rates and ensuring that safe and adequate service is provided by New York utilities. In addition, and particularly pertinent to today's discussion, the Commission has a mandate to promote efficient planning and conservation of resources. First and foremost in New York is our efforts under Governor Cuomo's Reforming the Energy Vision strategy to lead on climate change and grow New York's economy. REV is building a cleaner, more resilient, and affordable energy system for all New Yorkers by stimulating job-creating investment in clean technologies like solar, wind, and energy efficiency, and generating 50% of the state's electricity needs from renewable energy by 2030. REV is also ensuring that New York State reduces statewide greenhouse gases 40% by 2030 and achieves the internationally recognized target of reducing emissions 80% by 2050. Due to the success of Governor Cuomo's REV initiative, including the New York Sun solar program, we've seen installed solar across New York grow nearly 600% since 2012, and we've witnessed a dramatic increase in distributed resource interconnections. In 2012, there were approximately 2,000 interconnection applications made under the Standardized Interconnection Requirements, SIR, which establishes the requirements for new distributed generators to connect to the utility distribution system. And by 2015, that number has increased to approximately 11,000 for the year, a nearly six-fold increase. And the clean energy race continues. In the first quarter of 2016, there were 4,700 applications, up 138% from the same period a year ago. And the projects are getting larger. In terms of megawatts produced, projects in the first quarter totaled 1,876 megawatts. That's a 70% increase from the same period a year ago. The enormous interest from homeowners, small businesses, and large companies seeking to gain access to clean energy resources is clear-cut proof that REV is working. However, as with any significant challenge to the status quo, there are some growing pains, including an area of concern for both your committees, delays and cost barriers to interconnecting distributed resources to the grid. As we continue our work under REV, we're very cognizant of these issues and have taken several proactive steps to address them. To ensure that distributed resources are safely integrated into the electric grid, the Commission adopted the SIR, which provides guidance and information on the application process and associated deadlines, technical requirements for interconnection, standardized interconnection contract language, as well as net metering information. The SIR was created in 1998 and has been updated several times since. The SIR includes a fast-track process for projects 50 kW and below. Typically, a more in-depth review is required for larger projects depending on the project technology and complexity of the project. Overall, our goal is for the SIR process and interconnection procedures to provide the proper balance of safety concerns, technical requirements, and review time without unwarranted barriers in distributed generation interconnection on the electrical system by customers throughout the state. In March, we updated the SIR to better meet the needs of developers, customers, and utilities. We worked with the stakeholders and have several SIR modifications that were made to streamline the process so that developers could interconnect their systems without undue delay, while enabling utilities to make certain that the applications could be addressed in a safe and efficient manner. The modifications included providing customers and developers with more information up front around the viability of their system, creating a process to quickly identify whether a project would include a full impact study or could be done in a lesser study, giving the customers and developers a checklist of information that the utilities needed so that that process wasn't delayed, capping estimated interconnection cost contingencies so that the costs were more realistic and people could make business decisions, and most importantly, increasing the size threshold from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts to allow more projects into the standardized process. What we're hoping is that these changes will enhance and speed up the interconnection application and review process, as well as the overall interconnection process. They'll enhance the SIR, and while we're enhancing this, we're also recognizing that as we see the growth in this market, further changes need to be made. So a couple things that we're doing is, one, we've developed a high-level technical group involving the utilities and the solar developers so we can start looking at what are best practices across the country and how we could adopt these in New York, but also, obviously, as New York likes to lead, figure out what the best practices are for the future. The other two things that we've done, I think, are note is we've developed ombudspeople, both at the Department of Public Service and NYSERDA, to work with the solar developers, and each of the utilities have developed ombudspeople to work within their agencies. This provides developers a single point of contact, and if they have challenges, they know where to go, both at the Commission and at the NYSERDA, which is sort of expediting things along and allows us to quickly identify problems and start solving them. The other two areas that are really very critical to as we move for REV, which is really enabling distributed energy resources, in addition to interconnecting, is certainly pricing distributed energy resources and then standby rates. So in terms of pricing, the state has been using a net metering protocol, as you're aware. And while net metering, which uses the average price of electricity to price out the value of distributed resources, makes sense when there's not a huge volume of distributed resources on the system. Now we're moving into a system where we're looking at many, many more distributed energy resources, and it's going to be very important that they're priced out accurately. We don't want to either undervalue or overvalue these resources because we're integrating the ability to use things like behind-the-meter solar, CHP, and other systems into managing the grid and driving a more efficient electric network. In order to address this, we've started a procedure at the Commission to look at how we will accurately value distributed energy resources throughout the grid using pricing formulas that are very consistent with the full value of these resources. One of the things that I'm very appreciative of, and I want to note for the record here, is that throughout the country, states are grappling with this issue. You might have heard about the problems in Nevada, the problems in Arizona, and other states where there's almost all-out war between the utilities and the developers on how to price this. I think because of the leadership of REV and the commitment of this state of looking at clean energy and distributed energy as an important resource on the grid, what we're finding in our state is a very collaborative process. And we now have pending before us several very constructive proposals that the Commission can now consider on how to move us forward. And I think that's to the leadership of the state and the demonstrated commitment to clean energy that we're seeing this level of collaboration and constructive input. The other area that we're focused on is standby rates. Standby rates represent, of course, the cost to customers who want to put in behind-the-meter generation and may at times want to use the power grid either because they want to put their generation into maintenance mode or because the generator fails and they still need the system to provide electricity. The question here is always, well, what is the fair price to charge these customers for the backup that the grid is providing them? So in that, the Commission has issued several orders recently concerning standby rates. We've been looking to modify these to make them, again, as we're doing with pricing, much more modern. So we're looking at processes. We've already, last year, initiated an exemption for standby rates for projects that were put in after March 2000 or before March 2019. And to give them an exemption, because we wanted to energize that market. And we are now, through the REV process, looking at further modifications on the standby rates. The objective of the Commission is to make sure that standby customers are paying their fair share for the value that they're getting, but that the utilities are also crediting them for the values that they're providing. And so it's recognizing, again, that we're moving from a system that was unidirectional, where we basically all bought power from the power grid and customers were passive, to a world where we want customers to be more active. We call them prosumers. And when people invest in distributed energy resources, that we can value that for the system. So in conclusion, I think we're certainly at a very exciting time in New York. We're seeing a huge amount of activity in this space, a lot of early positive results from REV. And as you can imagine, in a transition of an industry as large and important as the energy industry, we are looking, issues that we're looking at the issues that are arising from making this change, and we are addressing them in a way that I think is extremely constructive and will be extremely valuable to all New Yorkers as we develop a much more efficient, clean energy system for our future. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Why don't I just start with one? You mentioned in your very comprehensive and thoughtful testimony that there have been several constructive proposals. I think that was the wording that you used. Several constructive proposals that have come forward and now are before the Public Service Commission to deal with net metering and how the utilities can happily relate to solar producers. My question is this. It's good that constructive proposals come forward from collaborations like this, but the collaboration may only be as good as the number of people and the representativeness of the collaborative body. There may be some, in other words, who are left out, smaller players. Could you just address that question as to the value of constructive proposals that come about as a result of collaborations when there are some who are left out of the collaboration?
Certainly. So first of all, when the way we establish this process for going from net energy metering to value-based pricing, and that's just full value for distributed energy resources, looking at the locational value of these resources on the system as well as the time value of these resources, so we get as much accurate pricing as possible, was what the Commission identified as their goal. And then we said we understand we're going to need a transition. So we asked the parties to come forward and give us some ideas on how we can have a transition. The starting point we have now are the proposals. So just to be very clear, the proposals before us are the start of the process, not the end of the process. And for me, the fact that there are several parties who've come up with different ideas, our process now is we're going to be having technical meetings, I think that scheduled as of next week, where parties will be able to come in and present those proposals. We will have reply comments. My staff will be asking questions. And so the end is that this has to be a solution for all, not for some, and that to the extent that any proposal is not comprehensive, it's obviously the role of the Commission to have a comprehensive proposal that is both neutral in terms of technology and neutral in terms of ownership structure. Our goal is valuing the resources and creating a transition market that promotes competition and doesn't inhibit it. So any of those concerns about people being left out and certain parties not being able to be successful would be issues that would be of great concern for us as we move forward.
Thank you. First, I want to acknowledge we've been joined by Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, who's a member of my committee. Your committee as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, both committees.
Welcome. Thank you for being here.
From the great borough of Brooklyn, my birthplace. So, I'm going to start with just some questions on the interconnection, and then jump to the standby rates. First, I recognize that that March was not that long ago. So we're just starting on the the expedited process, which we hope will fast forward some of the projects that have been in the queue. Do we have any idea of how many projects are waiting in that queue? Is there any idea of we've heard from solar developers that there are many in their individual, but I just didn't know whether there was any rough number.
The data we have on the queue as of March 2016 is that there's about 9,000 projects in the queue, but about 7,000 of those projects are small projects that would be expected to move through fairly rapidly. So that leaves a couple of thousand of projects that are larger projects.
Do we have any? Clearly we want to expedite them. What does that mean? Is there a time frame in your minds? So that someone who is trying to put solar on their home, or a developer who's trying to do a whole farm, for the grid. Is there a time frame that you're thinking is reasonable?
So the time frame for the small projects, the ones that are under 50 kW, so the stuff that's getting put on the home, is fairly quick. That goes through, in a couple of weeks. Most of those are not a whole lot different than applying for a service for a new home. Okay, so they're moving through. They're very efficient. The problem with the larger ones, especially as you get up in the 1 to 2 megawatt category, is you have to go through detailed engineering studies in order to determine what kind of impacts they're going to have on the reliability of the system. The SIR requirements provide 60 days just to do that study for the utilities. It's a fairly detailed process that does take a fair amount of work. So that kind of goes around the windows of them. The total time period is on the order of 90 to 100 days.
I would just say that, let me just add, so a couple things that we're looking to do to expedite these processes. One is we recently issued an order around distribution system planning, and we've asked the utilities to start identifying the locations on their grid that are going to be best for accommodated DER resources. Part of the problem that we see is that a developer may find a place that's good for solar, but may find that it's not necessarily good for the grid. And so being able to marry those up and have that information up front should expedite this process, because the utility will have already pre-identified that. The other piece that we know that the utilities are doing, and we're going to be working with them through this process of what is a reasonable time frame, is to staff up, because that's been part of the issue that, when you grow that quickly, you need to get more engineers to look at it. And then to certainly, from the other side of this is that many developers will put in multiple projects, some of which they think will go, some of which they won't. And then you might have a developer who has a real project who's sort of in line behind them. So we're also working with the developers to have them cull projects that they don't really think will go forward, so that you're not having to wait And so all of those are sort of various elements. I think as we move forward, we're going to expect the utilities to come up with faster ways, better ways to certainly automate smaller projects, particularly if they've identified areas on the grid where they know they can accommodate it. And, and I'm also expecting that the developers themselves will be much better at promoting projects that they actually intend to move forward, so we can speed all that up.
So, I guess the concern that we've heard even after the order came out was that, there's no hammer, to hold utilities accountable, and that, that an ombudsman is terrific, but, a mediator would be better because they still fear that, the guidelines will not be lived up to. So I just don't know if you have a reaction, or you're going to wait and see whether you thought about that, going forward.
Yeah, we have. I mean, I think that the way to me, the first thing is we set the standards. And so we walk through and we figure out what's reasonable. And, as we do everything else, we expect to see continuous improvement. Once we get the standards, because we were in a new normal, and we figure out what are the appropriate standards for the new normal, then I think the Commission can always look at imposing negative earnings penalties on utilities who fail to meet the standard. And so I think our approach is going to be two-step, because it's sort of, as we're figuring this out, it's unfair. In terms of the mediation, the ombuds people, I mean, I think that, and I know you have some developers here today, we by establishing this the ombuds people, what we're, it was easy.
Okay.
It's hard to, it's easier. It's harder to be PC
Persons
and
or
these
what have you.
persons or-
Right.
Ombuds is what they
Persons.
ombuds. Yeah,
Persons.
persons.
Ombudsman and women were.
Well, but it really allows for mediation. So, what happens is if there's an issue, my staff gets directly involved, and we have NYSERDA staff get directly involved to resolve it. And so mediation for a judge is one thing. Mediation with engineers who actually know what's going on is probably much faster, because we're able to walk through the data and make a determination whether it's, who's telling the truth. And that's a lot of what Mike's folks do.
And, clearly the order called for looking or growing, the amount of megawatts, right? But the order really speaks to everything 2 and lower. So I wondered what the plan is, for, up to 5. What is is it going to be a similar process? I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit.
Well, the SIR itself is focused on the interconnection aspect. Okay, the net metering laws that you set and that we follow, we just implement them with the SIR, but they don't establish those limits. So now if somebody comes in and wants to put a 4 megawatt distributed generation thing in as part of DER and as part of REV, they'll have to follow these interconnection requirements. So they'll go through the same process. We do offer, the requirements offer another 20 days to study them, because, the bigger these things and generators get, the more complicated they are. And as they tie into the transmission system, for example, it's going to be a more complicated study, so it does take longer. But the SIR applies to up to 5 megawatts.
Got it. I'm going to maybe jump a little bit to the standby charges. Is there, in establishing them, I mean, are there clear guidelines so that there's uniformity among the utilities when charging them? Is there uniformity for within a type of energy source, farm waste versus CHP? I'm unclear. Exactly how they're established, and the reason I ask that is I think that the people who are at the other end are unclear how they're established. So I just wondered, if there's a way to tell, and what thought you all have given to making them uniform if they're not.
So again, let me start on that. So they are uniform. They're tariffs, so that they're developed, and we review the tariffs and how they develop them. But the process and the elements of standby really are, if you think about it, are sort of three elements of the system. The first is, I call it, just for want as a non-engineering term, is the plug from the building to the grid. So if the building weren't there, and if the customer wasn't there, you wouldn't need it. It's that last mile attachment that really has no value other than to that particular customer. That's a cost, if you want to be interconnected to the grid, that we ask the customer to pay for, that aspect of it. Then you get into the system itself, and the question is, how much of this system cost should you allocate to the customer? And that really is what we're doing now in the distribution system integration planning. We're asking the utilities to get a much more updated look in identifying specifically those costs of their systems that just wouldn't be there if the customer wasn't there, and the costs that we're allocating that are really their fixed costs to have the system be able to provide that customer. And those types of costs, the issue is that how much are you going to rely on the system? And if, in fact, you want the system to be there during peak, then we have an issue because we need to make sure that there's sufficient capability to meet your load during peak. If you have customers who say they're willing to take their own risk, we're looking at an allocation that says, well, if you agree, and now, with smart metering we can do that you will disconnect if the system can't meet your needs because you only want to be there, as a backup, then that's a different cost allocation. The other piece, as I mentioned, is going to be what if they have customers, which we're hoping they'll have, is say they'll work with the utility. And so if we have a situation where the customer may have the ability to reduce their usage even further on the grid, and that's a period of time that the utility could use that, then there should be a payment back. So rather than thinking about that as an asset that's just for the benefit of the customer, it's really a benefit for the entirety of the grid, and so there should be compensation. So just as we're trying to modernize the value of distributed energy resources, we want to also modernize the concept of standby because we're really changing the nature of the system and saying that these resources are going to be resources don't just benefit the individual owner, but actually benefit everybody because they help us to derive a system that's more efficient and lower cost. And therefore, that there's a two-way value, and that has to be embedded in these charges because you don't want customers to make uneconomic decisions, either not size their system appropriately or elect not to put in distributed energy resources or elect to totally disconnect from the grid simply because you don't have the standby charges accurate. So through this process of having the utilities really do a full cost looking at a much deeper study, and then really looking at this valuation to get it as accurate as possible and pinpoint it as much as to what's really unavoidable because the customer's there versus what should be shared, and then how much should be shared based on the relationship between the customer and the utility is really what we're doing through the REV process.
So, it's complicated,
It's
right?
very complicated.
And of course, if someone is, and we know, particularly CHP for commercial buildings, or is particularly good for the grid because otherwise it's all peak.
Right.
It's all 9 to 5, for the most part. During those hot summer months, air conditioned all the time, and the cold months, heat during the key time, right? So it makes sense to try to do as much of that so you don't have to, have dirty fossil fuels all over the place, and
Right.
So it seems to me it would make a lot of sense to try to work with developers for them to understand, or to have a way of figuring out, if they had a certain size unit, that it would be a lot cheaper. For example, if it was so self-sufficient that they weren't going to be using power during peak times, I would assume the standby charge should be de minimis compared to one that would use it during peak times, which would cause us to have to grow energy at the wrong time. So, but I think that it would be very hard for a developer, even a sophisticated developer with a lot of engineers, to be able to understand what those costs are without some help, because I don't know how much interaction they're likely to have with the utility going through the process. I just don't know whether the Commission's thought about having someone on board, similar to an ombudsman for interconnection, to have an ombudsman to help, create a faster process for someone to establish what an appropriate standby charge is, so that we don't have development that's really going off the grid, so that we use the excess CHP or what have you, during the time that we would want to.
So we do have actually on my staff an individual who's leading up our development of our retail markets, who's been working with the developers to think through how do we create standby rates that do not operate as a barrier to entry to them. That's how we actually ended up last year doing this moratorium in terms of we allowed developers to come in and avoid the standby charges. What I heard from the developers is that moratorium, because it was only 4 years, was insufficient because they're making 20-year investments and they need to know what this is going to look like for the full period of the investment, not a partial period. So we're right now in the process of looking at how to make what that would look like on a permanent basis. And it is so tied up into this value pricing. If everyone knows, exactly how much they're going to get paid versus how much they need to pay, then they can make economic decisions. Our concern, of course, is always going to be that we don't over-allocate or under-allocate the fair share, because to the extent you undercharge, obviously those costs fall on somebody else if they're fixed. On the other hand, we want to be smart about it, that what these developers are essentially doing is they're allowing us to avoid future costs, and we want to credit them for the full value that they're going to be providing to making the grid more efficient and cleaner, et cetera. So that's really where we are now. We work very closely with REBNY. We're very, and so we're as one of the things that I would say is REV has evolved, is that the tent for us is much bigger than just obviously the regulators sitting down with the utilities. We work with the utilities, the consumer groups. We try to look. We certainly understand the business proposition for the utilities. We want to make sure we understand the business proposition on the other side, because the unintended consequence, of course, is that if we don't modernize regulation as we're trying to modernize the grid, we're going to be sending the wrong signal and have less opportunity to get private investment in than as we want. So we are in the track 2, which is where we're doing the regulatory design. This is one of the areas we're tackling. As I mentioned, we're also in our planning document where we're requiring the utility to put out their plans to really evaluate the cost, so that we have a much more updated viewpoint on where these costs are. And with that view, and if you combine that with what we're dealing with in terms of locational pricing, the objective is to make sure that we are maximizing the potential to use developers who are willing and want to put in distributed energy resources, to do it in a way that provides value to the system, because that's what we know. This is a common, in the sense that everything that people do to help reduce demand on the system not only helps them, but helps everybody else. And we certainly don't want to inadvertently minimize what we can do in that area.